Daniel Harper, a man whose 40 years etched a road map of sun and wind onto his face, and whose hands bore the permanent calluses of a life spent grappling with maps and gear, felt the familiar therapeutic calm as he traced a new route across a faded topographical chart. The air in the Yellowstone National Park archive was a brew of old paper, musty cardboard, and the fine dust of centuries of timber, an atmosphere where everything bent to the logic of geological formations and well-trod trails. He knew these smells, this quiet hum of history, as intimately as he knew the contours of the mountains outside. His world was one of measurable distances, predictable shifts in rock strata, and the reliable rhythm of the seasons. He had been tasked with cataloging a collection of antiquated land use documents, a job reserved for college interns or retirees looking for a quiet way to pass the time. Daniel enjoyed the solitude, the methodical nature of the work. Each brittle page, each hand-drawn boundary, told a story of settlement and retreat, of humanity's persistent, often futile, attempts to tame the wild heart of the park. That day, the late afternoon sun, already softening to an amber glow, spilled through the high, grimy windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stillness. He was deep in a stack of yellowish reports, many of them detailing minor land easements from the mid-20th century, their bureaucratic prose as dry as the paper it was printed on. His fingers, usually so sure and precise, brushed against something utterly out of place. It was a folder, thin and almost entirely disintegrated at the spine, tucked away amidst a sheaf of surveyor's notes. No labels, no identifying marks. Its cover was rough, unusually stiff, and beneath the ubiquitous scent of mildew that clung to everything old, Daniel detected another odor. It was faint but distinct, a pungent, heavy aroma that spoke of something long sealed away, like the bitter grief of forgotten years pressed between pages. He paused, his heart giving a small, unexpected flutter against his ribs. This was a deviation from the routine, a snag in the smooth fabric of his day. Carefully, he opened the folder. Inside, on a page detailing the particulars of a distant land allocation, written in a hasty pencil scrawl, was a single stark name: Redwood Falls. No dates, no surrounding text offering context, no explanation. Just that name, adrift in the faded ink of a forgotten report, whispered from the depths of the page, demanding an attention Daniel had not known he possessed. It sat there, a lonely buoy in a sea of meaningless data, and an inexplicable chill feathered across his skin, defying the warmth of the afternoon sun. He ran a calloused thumb over the penciled letters, feeling the slight indentation they left, as if the writer had pressed with unusual force or with a sudden desperate urgency. His gaze drifted to an old, well-worn park map spread out on the table beside him. It was a general overview, not one of the detailed topographical maps he worked with, but it held enough information to be useful. Following a premonition, Daniel searched for the name. His eyes scanned the familiar contours of the park, tracing known trails and peaks until he found it. A tiny, almost erased square, nestled deep within an area marked by a jagged dotted line. This was not just any restricted zone. This was the Forbidden Zone, a vast expanse of wilderness that snaked deep into the reserve, a place where tourists were strictly prohibited, and even park rangers, including Daniel himself, never ventured without explicit, usually emergency-related authorization. He always respected the boundary, seeing it as a necessary safeguard, a line drawn by common sense and federal regulation, But now his heart, which beat with the steady rhythm of his hiking boots on a mountain trail, began to quicken, a restless thrum responding to this sudden, unexpected discovery. There was a gaping void of information surrounding Redwood Falls, a stubborn silence in the historical record, and it stirred a profound, almost physical unease within him. It was an unsettling echo in the vastness of the park's history, a blank space that called to him, not with gentle invitation, but with a raw, insistent desire to know more. He felt a prickle of discomfort, a nascent anxiety that gnawed at the edges of his rational mind. What could be so thoroughly erased? What kind of secret could demand such complete silence? The decision, when it came, was sudden, like a gust of cold wind that swept away the familiar landscape of his certainties. The internal geologist, the man accustomed to digging into the Earth's past, took precedence over the cautious guide. He had to see this place. He had to feel its earth beneath his feet, to understand what lay hidden behind that forgotten name. The thought of the forbidden boundary, of the potential consequences, receded before the irresistible pull of the unknown. It was not a reckless impulse. It was a scientist's hunger for data, twisted by a preternatural curiosity that hummed like a taut wire in his chest. The preparations were swift, almost automatic. His heavy backpack, its canvas worn and patched, creaked with the weight of provisions. The metallic clink of carabiners and trekking poles against its frame was a familiar sound. But that day, it whispered of a journey into something far beyond his usual treks. He packed extra batteries for his flashlight, a good knife, a first aid kit, and more water than he thought he would need. As he slipped away from the park facilities, leaving behind the muted drone of the nearby town, the air grew colder, cleaner. The sharp scents of pine needles and damp earth became more acute, almost palpable, filling his lungs. Behind him, the structured world of maps and regulations dissolved. Ahead lay only a deep, primeval silence, and the undeniable, inexplicable allure of a lost place, a destination the park itself had intentionally forgotten. Daniel Harper was walking into a void, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the emptiness was a lie. The first day's journey into the heart of the Forbidden Zone was an absolute grind. Any semblance of a trail, however faint, vanished long ago, swallowed by a relentless tide of dense blackberry brambles and the gnarled, moss-covered bodies of fallen pine. The air was thick with the cloying scent of damp rot and decaying wood clinging to Daniel's clothes and skin. Sunlight, a rarity in these old-growth forests, struggled to pierce the impossibly dense canopy of ancient ponderosas, creating a constantly shifting, headache-inducing mosaic of light and shadow that strained his eyes and played tricks on his peripheral vision. He pushed forward, each step a deliberate effort, his muscles already protesting the arduous ascent. The familiar ache in his calves and shoulders was a comfort, a sign of honest physical work, but it was quickly overshadowed by something insidious. Gradually, subtly, a strangeness seeped into Daniel's consciousness, not all at once, but like a slow, creeping chill beneath his skin. The usual symphony of the forest, a soundscape he knew as intimately as his own heartbeat, was absent. There was no cheerful chirping of robins, no frantic buzz of unseen insects, no rustle of small animals darting through the underbrush. Only the rhythmic crunch of his own boots on dried twigs and fallen leaves echoed, deafeningly loud in this all-consuming, oppressive silence. It was a silence that felt unnatural, a void where life should have been, a profound stillness that resonated with an unsettling emptiness. He stopped once, mid-stride, holding his breath, listening intently. Nothing. Not even the whisper of a breeze in the pine needles. It was as if the forest itself had held its breath, waiting. With each passing hour, the feeling of being alone eroded, replaced by a growing, unnerving certainty that he was not. Invisible eyes watched his every movement from the depths of the shadowy thickets. It was not a feeling of being stalked by a bear or a mountain lion. This was different, deeper. The internal sense of danger, buried beneath layers of rational thought, clawed its way to the surface, manifesting as a persistent prickling sensation at the nape of his neck and a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his muscles. He found himself glancing over his shoulder more frequently, his hand unconsciously reaching for the large hunting knife strapped to his belt. The forest, once a place of solace and adventure, transformed into something alien and watchful. Later, as the trail continued its slow, winding ascent, Daniel stumbled upon something that froze his tracks. On the damp, rich earth, among the fallen leaves and pine needles, he saw them, a series of unusual indentations. They were too large for a wolf, too irregular for a bear's paw print. He knelt, tracing the outline with a hesitant finger. The prints were massive, leaving deep depressions, and bore the distinct impression of long, blunt claws. Whatever had made them was immensely heavy, and the impression was recent, the edges still sharp in the cold, sticky mud. He touched the moist earth, feeling its clammy coldness, and a shiver, unrelated to the dropping temperature, ran down his spine. His mind, usually quick to categorize and explain, offered no ready answers. The air, which until then had been thick with the clean scents of pine and wet earth, acquired a new, unsettling nuance. A faint but sharp metallic tang, like old blood or rusted iron, mixed with a stale dampness, reminiscent of ancient caves or abandoned mine shafts, infiltrated his lungs. It was an acrid, cloying smell that caused an unpleasant tickle in the back of his throat. He sniffed, trying to pinpoint its source, but it emanated from the very fabric of the forest itself. A phantom odor clinging to the air like a shroud. This was not the wholesome smell of nature, but something ancient, industrial, and deeply unsettling. As dusk settled, painting the dense forest in deepening shades of slate gray and indigo, Daniel's muscles coiled, bracing for an unknown threat. His mind, accustomed to explaining everything logically, now confronted something inexplicable, something that defied reason and amplified his growing anxiety. The weight of the silence, the unseen eyes, the bizarre tracks, the metallic stench, it all coalesced into a suffocating dread. He knew with a primal certainty that he could not stop. He had to push forward, find this forgotten place, and somehow confront the growing nightmare that slowly but surely closed in around him. To turn back now meant abandoning a piece of his own sanity, to leave a question unanswered that would haunt him forever. Then in the distance, through the thick veil of trees, he noticed a strange alteration in the landscape. The forest receded, parting to reveal a small clearing. It was an unnatural phenomenon, a deliberate separation of the dense growth. A chilling premonition, a deep-seated feeling that he stood on the threshold of something awful and irreversible, caused his heart to clench in a vice-like grip. Each step became heavier, each breath a conscious effort, but he was unable to halt his progress. The clearing called to him, a silent, gaping maw promising answers and an end to the world he knew. He was walking into a story, and the story had already begun to write itself in the dark, silent heart of the woods. Through the last reluctant screen of thick, gnarled trees, Daniel finally pushed his way into the clearing. What lay before him was Redwood Falls, or what remained of it. The forest, true to the premonition, held its breath around this place. The trees stood at a respectful distance, forming an unnaturally precise circle, etched by an invisible hand. The first thing that caught his eye was the skeletal remains of an asphalt road, now heavily overgrown with thick moss and young birch saplings that stubbornly pushed their way through the cracks, a testament to nature's slow, persistent reclamation. It was a road leading nowhere, ending here in this bowl of quiet desolation. The air here was profoundly heavy, thick and still, as if saturated with unspoken sorrows and solidified time. Not a single breath of wind stirred the decaying leaves or rustled the skeletal branches, leaving the dead silence inviolable. It pressed down on him, a physical weight that absorbed all sound. Amidst this oppressive atmosphere, the leaning foundations of old houses stood stark against the sky. Their wooden frameworks had long since rotted away, leaving only the stone skeletons, rough-hewn and now thickly encrusted with mottled lichen, like ancient, forgotten tombs. Daniel noticed a peculiar sheen on some of the stones, a faint, iridescent glow that pulsed in the muted light, a sickly, unsettling color that was neither natural nor artificial. He moved slowly, deliberately, deeper into the spectral town. Near one of the larger foundations, which had once been a family home, he spotted a set of rusted swing chains, the seat long gone, protruding from the overgrown earth. They stood there, solitary and forlorn, a stark symbol of lost innocence. He heard the faint, mournful creak of the chains under the imagined weight of children's laughter that once filled this space. Now they were mute and motionless, a stark monument to a past irrevocably gone, a childhood lost to some terrible, unspoken event. A profound sadness, sharp and sudden, pierced through the layers of dread he'd built around himself. Among the scattered ruins, he found a semi-collapsed building, instantly recognizable as the former schoolhouse. Inside, dull gray light filtered through the broken window panes, illuminating a scene of quiet desolation. A few overturned desks lay scattered like fallen soldiers. On one wall, miraculously still hanging, was an old, peeling blackboard. Daniel reached out, his fingers brushing away a thick layer of dust, and through the grime, a chalk inscription slowly became visible. March 1967. The date hung there, frozen on the slate, a final word. A last moment before everything had vanished, leaving only this silent, haunting record. He felt a profound chill, a sense of intrusion into a moment of collective doom. There were no people, no discernible signs of lingering life, not the scurry of a mouse. But every movement Daniel made, every rustle of his clothing, echoed with deafening intensity in that tomb-like silence. The oppressive feeling of being watched intensified, clawing at his sanity. Faint rustles he could not pinpoint, shadows that danced at the periphery of his vision, fleeting, momentary silhouettes that disappeared behind crumbling pillars the instant he turned his head. All of it triggered sharp, visceral surges of primal terror, sparking a desperate urge to run, to flee this cursed place. He gripped the heavy flashlight in his hand, its cold metal a small comfort against the encroaching dread. The air inside the school was thick, with the scent of ancient, decaying wood encroaching moss and something else, something subtly bitter and indescribably poignant. It was a smell Daniel could not identify, but intuitively connected to abandonment and a profound, irreparable loss. It was the scent of a place where life had ceased abruptly and forever, leaving behind only the faintest, most mournful phantom echoes, clinging to the rotting timbers and the crumbling stones like a memory made tangible. It was the smell of dreams unfulfilled, of lives truncated. The sun, an accomplice in this silent horror, dipped lower, painting the sky with bruised purples and oranges. Shadows lengthened, distorting into monstrous, twisted forms that writhed and reached out from the crumbling walls. The feeling of being trapped, truly ensnared, became a crushing certainty. He knew, with a chilling clarity, that remaining here for the night was an act of madness. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back, to escape. But an inexplicable force, a potent, unseen allure of this place, held him fast, pinning him to the spot, making departure an impossible, even sacrilegious act. He stood there, alone in the dead heart of Redwood Falls, as the encroaching darkness slowly, inexorably, began to swallow him whole. Night descended upon Redwood Falls like a thick velvet shroud, suffocating the last vestiges of light. The cold, a damp, bone-seeping chill, intensified, piercing Daniel to the marrow despite the small, struggling fire he had managed to coax from damp kindling in a relatively sheltered corner of what had once been the town square. The acrid smoke from the wet branches struggled upwards, a thin, gray column dissolving instantly into the voiceless, impenetrable darkness overhead. Every snap and hiss of the sputtering embers was impossibly loud, aggressively intrusive in the profound silence. Daniel huddled closer to the meager warmth, his eyes darting into the inky blackness beyond the firelight, his breath clouding visibly in the frigid air. Suddenly, from the deep, unforgiving maw of the surrounding forest, a howl erupted. It was unlike any sound Daniel heard. It was not the familiar lonesome cry of a single wolf. This was a sound too deep, too impossibly resonant, too multifaceted. It was as if several creatures howled at once, their voices intertwining in a terrifying primal symphony that pulsed with ancient hunger and an unsettling, intelligent coordination. The sound was not merely heard. It penetrated the very walls of his skull, vibrating through his bones, causing his muscles to involuntarily clench and his heart to give a violent, sickening lurch against his ribs. He felt a primal terror, a cold, predatory fear that bypassed all rational thought. The howling continued, now closer, echoing off the crumbling foundations and skeletal remains of the buildings, a chorus of despair and menace. Daniel fumbled for his powerful flashlight, its beam a frantic, impotent white spear against the overwhelming blackness. The light danced wildly, sweeping across surrounding shadows and the twisted dead trees, momentarily illuminating grotesque, distorted shapes before plunging them back into darkness. Cold sweat, clammy and slick, streamed down his back, chilling him further. His breathing became shallow, ragged, catching in his throat like sandpaper. He strained his ears, trying to determine the direction, the number, the intent of whatever was out there. But the sound was everywhere, an omnipresent force. Then, from the oppressive depths of the thick darkness, at first indistinct, shifting silhouettes, then with increasing clarity, 3 massive figures emerged. They were huge, their forms elongated and powerfully muscled, eclipsing the feeble firelight, and they were massive. Daniel froze, his lungs refusing to draw another breath, his entire being locked in a terrifying stasis. He saw their eyes. They glowed with a dull, steady amber light, piercing the suffocating darkness like smoldering coals, fixing him with an unnerving, unblinking gaze. They were not just eyes. They were beacons of ancient, terrible sentience. The figures approached, moving with an unnatural grace that belied their immense size. They made no sound beyond a heavy, low growl that vibrated deep within his chest cavity more than he heard with his ears. It was a resonant thrum, a sound of immense power held in check. Their gait was bipedal but utterly inhuman, a predatory, almost fluid motion that spoke of raw, untamed strength. They fanned out, surrounding Harper, their towering forms casting long, wavering shadows that danced in the firelight. Yet remarkably, they did not attack. There was no overt aggression, no snarling, no lunging, only that piercing amber gaze and the low, resonant growl. Instead of assaulting him, they shepherded him, gently, almost imperceptibly, but with an undeniable, inexorable force. Their massive bodies served as unseen walls, guiding him. They moved him toward the center of the square, where, amidst the crumbling ruins, the roofless skeleton of the old church loomed. Its broken stone walls rose starkly into the night sky, like accusing fingers pointing at some forgotten transgression, and the gaping holes where windows once stood stared out like empty, dark eye sockets, watching the slow, inexorable progression of time and decay. Inside the church, under the vast open canopy of the night sky, Daniel's flashlight beam, still trembling in his hand, fell upon something even more chilling than the creatures themselves. Carved into the stone flagstones that formed the church's floor were names. Dozens of names, arranged in neat, orderly rows, almost like gravestone inscriptions. He dropped to his knees, heedless of the cold, rough stone, desperate to make them out in the weak light. Each name, he felt, whispered to him, a mournful, collective echo of the fates of those who had once lived in this forgotten place. A profound, aching sorrow mingled with his terror. Who were these people? What had happened to them? The amber eyes of his silent escorts watched him, unblinking, as he confronted the ghosts of Redwood Falls. In the profound silence of the ruined church, broken only by Daniel's own ragged, frantic breaths, and the distant, mournful baying that still occasionally echoed from the deeper woods, a terrifying realization pierced his mind like a shard of ice. These names. They were not just names carved into stone. This was a list. And these creatures. He slowly lifted his gaze from the cold flagstones to look at them again, at their immense, unsettling shadows, at the unwavering intensity of their amber eyes. There was no aggression in their gaze, he now understood, but rather an ancient, fathomless sorrow, a deep, collective melancholy that weighed on the very air around them. The fragmented images, the disparate horrors he had encountered, began to coalesce into a horrifying, undeniable truth. The town's sudden disappearance, the pervasive, unnatural silence that preceded it, the strange, massive tracks he had found on the trail, the impossible, multi-voiced howl, and now, these immense, silent creatures, leading him to this list of names as if to an altar. The residents of Redwood Falls had not simply vanished without a trace. They had changed. His rational, scientific mind recoiled violently, struggling to reject the unthinkable, but his primal instincts screamed with the undeniable, bone-deep certainty of the truth. They had not merely disappeared. They had transformed. They had become werewolves. But not by some archaic curse, not through a dark, mystical ritual. This was not the work of malevolent witchcraft or ancient evil. It was something profoundly different, something born of a far deeper, more desperate necessity. His mind, reeling, frantically sought an explanation, attempting to force this incredible reality into some recognizable framework of logic. This was a protective response, a transformation forged by an unimaginable need, a horrific, desperate reaction to something unspeakable that had threatened to extinguish them completely. It was a terrible, desperate evolutionary leap, a last, desperate grasp at survival. He felt their gazes upon him, heavy and unblinking, as his slow, agonizing comprehension unfolded. They were watching him, allowing him to put the pieces together. From them emanated the rich, complex scent of the forest floor, of damp earth, and something wild, deeply animal, yet strangely, profoundly human. It was not the smell of a ravenous predator, but rather the scent of something ancient and suffering, something burdened by an unspeakable weight. It was a scent that mingled with the musty damp of the church and the fainter metallic tang he had come to associate with this place. The cold that permeated the night air, seeping into his bones and chilling him to the core, seemed utterly insignificant compared to the icy, paralyzing cold of the realization that now thoroughly permeated his entire being. Daniel Harper, the rationalist to his very core, the geologist who believed only in verifiable facts and empirical evidence, was now confronted with pure, unadulterated horror, a monstrous truth that stretched far beyond the feeble reach of his human comprehension. His carefully constructed world, built on logic and science, shattered around him, revealing a chasm of terror he had not known existed. In their amber eyes, through the fierce, bestial nature that was now undeniable, he discerned something that looked astonishingly like a plea, a profound, ancient sadness. They were not simply monsters, he understood now. They were guardians. But guardians of what? Why were they here, trapped in this perpetual twilight existence? Questions swarmed in his head, a furious, dizzying maelstrom. But there were no answers, only the crushing, overwhelming presence of these changed beings, their sorrowful eyes burning into his. Their silence, he now understood, was not an absence of communication, but a heavy, articulate language of profound suffering. As if in response to his silent torment, the first faint rays of dawn began to penetrate the gaping holes in the church roof, casting a pale, ghostly light across the stone slabs with their carved names. The creatures stirred, their massive forms withdrawing slowly, silently, dissolving into the pre-dawn mist as soundlessly as they had appeared. Daniel was left utterly alone, kneeling amidst the names of the lost, with a crushing, unbearable truth that had forever altered the landscape of his world and irrevocably changed the man he thought he was. The amber eyes might be gone, but their burning image was seared into his soul, a permanent brand of an unspeakable reality. The morning after the nightmare brought no solace, only a deeper, more profound sense of shock. The pale, indifferent sunlight now illuminating the shattered ruins of Redwood Falls made them appear even more horrifying in their stark reality. Daniel felt an acute dryness in his mouth, his tongue like sandpaper, and a relentless throbbing pain pulsed behind his temples. Every fragmented memory of the preceding night felt like a grotesque scrap of a terrifying dream. Yet the names starkly etched into the cold stone of the church floor offered irrefutable proof that it had all been terrifyingly real. He kept expecting the amber-eyed figures to reappear, their silent, sorrowful presence now almost a comfort compared to the crushing weight of his solitary thoughts. He was still kneeling among the names when from behind the skeletal frame of a collapsed house, a figure emerged, utterly silent. It was a man, perhaps in his late 50s, his face gaunt and etched with lines, yet possessing an unnerving, almost preternatural calm. He wore old-fashioned but remarkably clean clothes, a thick woolen shirt and sturdy canvas pants that were utterly out of place in this desolate, forgotten locale. His eyes were a deep, piercing blue, but in their depths, Daniel caught a fleeting, barely perceptible glint, a vibrant spark that was disturbingly familiar, eerily akin to the amber glow he had witnessed in the darkness of the previous night. The man moved with a quiet dignity, as if he belonged here, as if this broken place was his natural domain. The man introduced himself, his voice a low, even murmur devoid of any discernible emotion. "Jonathan Crowell," he stated, the name hanging in the heavy air. His tone was strangely dispassionate, as if he were discussing the day's weather rather than the unspeakable, otherworldly events that had just transpired. He walked over to a fallen stone, its surface smoothed by decades of rain and wind, and sat down with a quiet grace, gesturing with an open palm for Daniel to follow his example. Every one of Jonathan's movements was deliberate, utterly calm, imbued with a patience that spoke of vast, unimaginable stretches of time, as if he had been waiting for Daniel Harper for countless decades. Jonathan began to speak, his words, cloaked in that same calm, almost detached manner, resonating like an echo from long-vanished events. He spoke of Redwood Falls, of its ordinary inhabitants, of the pervasive quiet that had descended upon the town long before the catastrophe. But this silence, he explained, was not the tranquil hush of the forest. It was a different kind of quiet altogether, a growing, humming, creeping silence that seemed to suck the very air from the surrounding world, a prelude to something far worse than mere absence. It was a predatory silence full of unseen menace. "The town," Jonathan explained, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the ruins, was attacked. Not by men, not by any of the forest animals known to man. It was by something else, creatures that came from beneath the earth. He paused, allowing the implications to settle, the air growing even heavier. Predatory things, resembling giant, impenetrably black insects, with carapaces that shone with a sickly, iridescent gleam in the dying light, and mandibles that could shear through solid timber as if it were kindling. Jonathan's voice remained level, but Daniel almost felt the tremor in the earth, the ground shaking with their arrival, the air filling with the putrid stench of sulfur and decomposing meat, a memory so potent it felt like a present reality. The people, Jonathan continued, had died by the dozens, their screams swallowed by the vast, uncaring wilderness, their pleas for help lost to the oppressive silence. No one had come, until something unimaginable had happened. Several families, pushed to the very brink of complete annihilation, had changed. Their bodies had warped, transformed, becoming beast-like, immense, infused with a primitive, untamed strength that allowed them to fight back against the unknown threat. It was not a curse, Jonathan said, his eyes finally meeting Daniel's, and in their depths, Daniel saw not madness, but an ancient, profound sorrow. It was a desperate evolutionary leap, a defensive mechanism forged in the crucible of absolute terror, a primal response to an existential threat. Jonathan concluded his tale, his gaze unwavering, locked with Daniel's. Over time, these new creatures, these werewolves, had taken on the role of guardians. They had successfully repelled the immediate threat, driving the subterranean horrors back into their lightless burrows beneath the earth. But they could no longer return to their human lives. Their home, Redwood Falls, had become their eternal prison, and their new monstrous form, their sacred duty. To maintain an everlasting vigil, a ceaseless watch over the boundary, ensuring that the ancient evil never again breached its underground prison. A profound, crushing weight settled upon Daniel, a terrible truth that now bound him to this forgotten, cursed place. Jonathan Crowell, his face now truly looking as if carved from ancient stone, spoke words that resonated with a chilling finality in Daniel's mind. The guardians, he explained, his voice still low even, they do not attack people. Not as long as the town's boundaries remain untouched, undisturbed. Their purpose, their sole reason for existence, is to hold this territory closed, sealed off from the world. He paused, his deep blue eyes holding Daniel's gaze with an intensity that burned. Because the things beneath the earth, they have not vanished. They still stir. They sleep. Yes, but they are not dead. Not truly. And they will try again. The implication hung heavy in the air, a sword of Damocles suspended over their heads. Harper felt an internal battle rage within him. On one side, an incredible, almost intoxicating wave of relief washed over him. He had not been torn apart. He had not been devoured. But immediately rising to meet it was a fresh surge of raw horror, overwhelming in its scale. He wanted to leave, to run, to scramble back along the silent trail and put as much distance as possible between himself and this place. This impossible truth that contradicted every scientific principle he had ever held sacred. He drew a deep, shuddering breath trying to fill his lungs, but his heart hammered an erratic, desperate rhythm against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. Jonathan, as if sensing Daniel's internal turmoil, slowly rose to his feet. His figure, already imposing, loomed even larger against the backdrop of the shattered ruins, imbued with a quiet power that was both ancient and terrible. He looked at Daniel, and in his eyes, Daniel saw not anger or judgment, but an expression of profound, eons-old weariness, a fatigue that had settled into his very bones. "You must choose, Harper," he said, his voice barely a whisper in the desolate silence, yet each word landed with the weight of granite. To leave, and to somehow, impossibly forget. Or... His sentence hung unfinished in the thick, heavy air, its unspoken conclusion pressed down on Daniel's shoulders with the unbearable weight of inevitability. Then, abruptly, the very earth beneath their feet began to tremble. It started subtly, a low, barely perceptible vibration, like a distant rumble of thunder. Almost instantly, the tremor intensified, became more pronounced, a violent shiver that shook the ground. On a forgotten, half-rotted table in a half-collapsed house nearby, old porcelain cups rattled, their fragile edges chattering a frantic, desperate rhythm. Shards of broken glass, clinging to the warped window frames, rained down with a tinkling cascade, shattering on the stone floors below. The air, already heavy, filled with a low, rising hum, a resonant thrum that vibrated through Daniel's teeth and bones, a sound that spoke of immense subterranean power stirring from slumber. Jonathan let out a sharp, guttural cry. His preternatural calm shattered instantly, revealing a raw, ancient horror Daniel had not expected. With an ear-splitting roar that tore through the very fabric of the air and a fountain of churned earth and broken asphalt, one of the ancient creatures erupted from beneath what had once been the town's main street. It was an abyssal horror, a colossal, chitinous monstrosity, black as pitch, with a carapace that gleamed sickly in the pale morning light, its segmented body longer than a full-sized freight truck. It heaved itself out of the ground, showering them with dirt and rocks. The beast slowly, horrifyingly, unfolded its immense form, revealing a nightmarish anatomy. Its mandibles, glistening and dripping with a viscous fluid, were massive, capable of snapping a pine tree in half with a single sickening crack. A multitude of legs, each armed with razor-sharp claws, scraped against the shattered asphalt. From its monstrous body emanated a sharp, acrid stench, a sickening cocktail of decay, sulfur, and chitin, which burned in Daniel's nostrils. Its numerous dull eyes were scattered across its grotesque head like clusters of obsidian beads, each one catching every flicker of light, every shadow, every terrified movement. Then, from the depths of the surrounding forest, as if in response to an unspoken command, the shadows reappeared. These were the guardians, the werewolves, and their numbers were far greater than Daniel had seen the previous night. Their amber eyes, no longer sorrowful, now blazed with a fierce, unwavering fury and a terrible, desperate resolve. Without a moment's hesitation, they surged forward, a wave of raw power, hurtling themselves into battle. Their massive bodies converged with the monstrous creature, merging into a swirling, frenzied mass of fur, claws, and chitin, creating a scene of primal chaos and unimaginable violence. For the very first time, Daniel Harper saw them not as monstrous horrors, but as valiant soldiers prepared to die, to offer their very lives to contain an unspeakable, overwhelming threat that lurked beneath the scarred earth. The battle raged, a primal, visceral clash unfolding directly before Daniel's eyes. The werewolves, moving with the preternatural speed and fluidity of shadows, darted and weaved around the immense chitinous creature, a swirling vortex of fur and muscle. They sought any vulnerable chink in its armored body, their massive claws tearing at its iridescent carapace, their powerful jaws snapping and biting at the segmented joints. Each attack was a desperate, furious attempt to bring down the beast. But the subterranean horror responded with equal ferocity, its colossal mandibles clacking with a sound like 100 axe blades, its numerous legs delivering crushing blows that splintered stone and ripped earth. The air became thick, cloying with the coppery tang of fresh blood, the pungent aroma of churned earth, and the acrid, indescribable stench emanating from the monstrosity's shimmering hide. The sounds of the battle were deafening, a cacophony of primal terror and desperate rage. The low, guttural snarls and ferocious growls of the werewolves mingled with the piercing, inhuman shrieks of the creature, a sound that grated on Daniel's very soul. There was the sickening crack of breaking bones, the repulsive crunch of chitin splintering under immense force. Daniel, pressed tight against the rough-hewn stone of a ruined wall, felt every vibration of the brutal combat course through his own body, as if he himself were an unwilling participant in this furious, desperate struggle for survival. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, wishing he could unsee it. But the sounds and vibrations were too real, too immediate. One of the werewolves, a massive, grizzled male with eyes that had burned particularly bright, took a devastating blow from one of the creature's flailing limbs. Its body flew sideways with sickening force, colliding with a pile of rubble before falling to the ground with a soft, lifeless thud. Jonathan, who had stood grimly beside Daniel, his face a mask of silent anguish, cried out. He launched himself forward, a desperate, futile attempt to distract the gargantuan creature, but his human strength was laughably insufficient against such a horror. In that instant, Daniel, driven by an overwhelming surge of protective rage, snatched up a jagged piece of metal rebar from the ruins, its rough surface cold and unforgiving in his trembling hand. He charged forward, not knowing why, only knowing he had to act. He swung the heavy rebar with all his might, aiming a desperate blow at one of the creature's armored legs. The metal scraped and shrieked against the incredibly hard carapace, a futile, pathetic sound that produced nothing more than a faint spark. It inflicted no visible damage, no discernible pain. The creature merely turned its enormous, multifaceted head towards him, its numerous dull eyes like a cluster of obsidian beads, fixing on Daniel. For a terrifying, eternal moment he saw the bottomless blackness within those alien eyes, felt the cold, indifferent malevolence radiating from them. A wave of paralyzing, pure panic washed over him, rooting him to the spot, making his limbs feel like lead. Before the creature could react, before its massive mandibles could snap shut on Daniel, another werewolf, a female, its amber eyes blazing with an almost suicidal determination, threw itself desperately in the path of the oncoming attack. With a sickening, resonant crunch of bone, a short, heart-wrenching howl that died almost instantly, the immense body of the guardian absorbed the full force of the mandibles meant for Daniel. It collapsed to the ground, a silent, unmoving heap. Blood, hot and viscous, gushed onto the dirty asphalt, mixing with the churned earth and dust, painting a grotesque tableau. Daniel choked, the metallic taste of fear and blood suddenly sharp on his tongue, a phantom sensation that seared his mouth. In that horrific moment, something fundamental within Daniel fractured. The irrational fear he had held for the werewolves, born of ancient folklore and primal instincts, utterly vanished. It was replaced by a profound respect, a reverent awe. He no longer saw them as monsters, but as martyrs, as valiant warriors condemned to an eternal, thankless struggle against an unimaginable evil. Their sacrifices were tragically real, their pain palpable, their heroism undeniable. They were not mere beasts. They were the desperate, final line of defense. After an eternity of agonizing, brutal struggle, the remaining werewolves, their bodies scarred and bleeding, broke the monster's resistance. With a deafening, earth-shaking crash, the colossal creature toppled, its immense mandibles falling still, its numerous dull eyes dimming to lifeless obsidian. The trembling of the earth subsided, and a tense, heavy silence descended once more upon Redwood Falls. But the price of victory was tragically high. 2 werewolves lay motionless on the desecrated ground, their vibrant amber eyes extinguished forever, their noble sacrifice marking the stained earth. Daniel stood frozen, witness to a horror and a heroism that would forever haunt his waking and sleeping hours. The aftermath of the battle hung heavy in the air, a visceral cocktail of coppery blood, freshly torn earth, and the sickening metallic tang of dead chitin. The silence that followed the deafening roars and grating shrieks was even more oppressive, a palpable weight that pressed down on Daniel, stealing his breath. He stood, his chest heaving, his hands trembling uncontrollably. His mind stubbornly refused to fully accept the monstrous reality he had just witnessed. His world, once so orderly and predictable, had been ripped open, revealing a chasm of unspeakable horror and unimaginable bravery. The remaining werewolves, their powerful chests heaving with exhaustion, their fur matted with grime and blood, gathered slowly, mournfully around their fallen comrades. A low, sorrowful growl, thick with deep grief and profound pain, filled the air, a collective lament that needed no translation. With a careful tenderness that belied their terrifying forms, they gently lifted the limp bodies of their brethren, carrying them away, deeper into the forest, back towards the veiled depths from which they had emerged. It was a ritual, understood without words, a silent, solemn farewell, an acceptance of their eternal, bloody fate. Daniel watched them disappear, a hollow ache growing in his own chest. Jonathan Crowell, his face now streaked with earth and the dark smear of blood, limped heavily, clutching his left shoulder. A gash, deep and ragged, torn by the creature's razor claws, bled steadily, staining his worn woolen shirt a dark crimson. Despite his own fear and the lingering shock that left him feeling disembodied, Daniel instinctively rushed to Jonathan's side, desperate to offer aid, however inadequate. He tore a strip of fabric from his own shirt, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline and terror, and tied it awkwardly around the gaping wound, pressing down to staunch the flow. Jonathan merely offered a weak, tired smile, his eyes filled with an ancient, bone-deep exhaustion. "Thank you, Harper." His voice was a raw, rasping whisper, thick with effort. "But it's useless for me. You saw. An ordinary man is powerless here. We are not as strong as they are." He spoke these words without bitterness, merely with the quiet, resigned acceptance of a fundamental truth, as if commenting on the inevitable setting of the sun. There was no self-pity, only a stark, unflinching recognition of his own limitations against such forces. Daniel felt a fresh wave of shame, knowing his own brief, pathetic attempt to help had been just as futile. Jonathan, leaning heavily against a fragment of the church wall, fixed Daniel with a stare of such profound seriousness that it pierced him to the core. "You saw the town, Harper," he said, his gaze unwavering, cutting through Daniel's every defense. "You saw our war. You know the truth." These words were not a question, but a pronouncement. A terrible verdict that sealed Daniel's fate as surely as if it had been carved into the same stone as the names in the church floor. The knowledge was no longer a secret to be contained. It was a burden, a responsibility that had now irrevocably altered his life. "Now," Jonathan continued, his voice regaining some of its earlier quiet power, "you will have to decide." He extended a hand towards Daniel, a hand smeared with dirt and his own blood, offering a tangible choice. "You can leave, and never speak of this. Never breathe a word to anyone. Otherwise, the town itself ensures its silence." His voice dropped, becoming a low, chilling rumble. "Or you can stay, and become part of those who guard the border, part of us." The choice hung in the heavy air between them, monumental and terrifying, like a granite slab poised to fall. To leave meant returning to a world that now was distant and unreal, a world he could no longer truly inhabit, knowing a secret that would surely tear his sanity to shreds. To stay meant accepting a destiny that was horrifying, unimaginable. But now, after everything he had witnessed, it was the only possible, the only right path. A sudden gust of wind, the first he had felt in days, swept over the dead town, carrying with it the smell of decay and the scent of a decision, hovering on the precipice of his soul. Jonathan's words, a low, gravelly echo, reverberated relentlessly in Daniel's head, drowning out every other thought. His mind became a furious battleground, a desolate landscape where the last vestiges of his ingrained rationality clashed violently with the monstrous, overwhelming irrationality of what he witnessed. Fear, raw and visceral, wrestled with a burgeoning, almost unbearable sense of duty. The primal instinct to survive, to flee, was now pitted against a chilling, inescapable awareness of the desperate need to protect. He felt his old world, the comfortable, predictable reality he had always known, slowly but inexorably crumbling beneath the relentless onslaught of this new, hideous truth. He wrestled with the crushing weight of the ultimatum. He knew he could not force himself to leave, to turn his back on Redwood Falls, and he could not return to his previous life. To the mundane conversations about tourist routes, to the easy, careless jokes of his colleagues, to the illusory comfort of civilization. Truly knowing, that behind the thin, deceptive veil of the quiet forest lurked this profound horror, this ceaseless, eternal war against an unspeakable evil. His former life now was a hollow mockery, a fragile, false construct riddled with lies and ignorance. The thought of it made his stomach clench. Every familiar object, every reassuring routine felt tainted, absurd. He kept seeing the eyes of the guardians, their piercing amber light, their profound, silent sorrow, their astonishing courage in the face of annihilation. He had witnessed their sacrifice, felt the spray of blood, smelled the acrid stench of their battle. A crushing wave of guilt and responsibility began to bear down on him, heavy and suffocating. He could not walk away. He could not abandon them, knowing that these changed beings, these tragic heroes, risked their lives every single day to hold back an unspeakable darkness from spilling out into the unsuspecting world. The thought was repugnant, a betrayal of everything he now understood. He spent the remainder of that day and the long, agonizing night in a state of restless, terrifying semi-sleep. His dreams were a flickering, kaleidoscopic nightmare, a swirling chaos of burning amber eyes and the obsidian sheen of black, chitinous bodies. He heard the low, resonant growls and the sickening, grinding scrape of otherworldly claws, but he no longer distinguished them from the whisper of the wind through the skeletal trees or the rustling of fallen leaves. The once clear boundary between reality and nightmare had blurred, dissolved, leaving him adrift in a terrifying, indistinguishable realm where horror and existence were one and the same. Jonathan Crowell, a sentinel figure, observed him from a distance. His presence, though silent and unmoving, was a constant, palpable weight, a silent pressure. He did not intervene, did not press Daniel for an immediate answer. He understood, Daniel realized, that this was a decision Daniel had to make entirely on his own, a choice that had to be sifted through the deepest, darkest chambers of his own soul. The burden of this terrible knowledge, a truth too immense for any single man, now lay on Harper's chest like a crushing, immovable stone, threatening to suffocate him. Finally, just before the first hint of false dawn, Daniel rose. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the edge of Redwood Falls, to that very line where the forest, for reasons known only to itself, receded. He looked back at the faint, overgrown trail that had led him here, a path that now was utterly alien, belonging to another life, another man entirely. The journey back was no longer merely a physical distance to be covered. It was a metaphysical chasm, a gaping abyss between who he was and who he would become. He understood with a chilling clarity that he could never return as the man he had been. That Daniel Harper was already gone, irrevocably lost in the shadows of this cursed place. He took a deep, shuddering breath, inhaling the complex scent of the forest, the rich, damp earth, and something subtly new, something almost primordial, almost native. It was a smell that no longer repulsed him, but instead resonated with a strange, dark familiarity. The Daniel Harper who had entered this forest, the rational geologist and park guide, was no more. In his place stood an altered, broken, yet profoundly new individual, a man whose fate was now and forevermore inextricably linked to this place, to this terrible secret, to this unseen eternal war. His choice was made, not with spoken words, but with a silent, profound acceptance that resonated to his very bones. Redwood Falls had claimed him, and he had, in turn, claimed it. The journey back from Redwood Falls took several days, but to Daniel, each passing hour stretched into an agonizing eternity. His steps, once purposeful and light, were now heavy, almost dragging. His head a dull throb of incessant, terrifying thoughts. He felt profoundly alien in his own skin. His body had become a vessel for something other than himself. The forest, which for so many years had been a place of comfort and belonging, now was a mere deceptive curtain, a flimsy disguise for something far deeper, far darker, and infinitely more malevolent that pulsed just beneath its surface. He finally reached the park boundary, the invisible line separating the forbidden zone from the world he had left behind. There, on cue, he encountered a group of park rangers, their faces familiar, their smiles easy. They greeted him with the usual banter, joking about his prolonged absence, wondering if he had gotten lost. Daniel tried to respond, to offer a reassuring smile, but his lips were numb, unresponsive. Words, desperate to articulate the horrors he had witnessed, inexplicably snagged in his throat, his larynx constricting, his lungs suddenly starved for air. He could not, physically could not, utter a single coherent syllable about where he had been or what he had seen. He struggled, an internal agony raging, attempting to force out the truth about Redwood Falls, about Jonathan Crowell, about the amber-eyed guardians and the monstrous subterranean creatures. But the words, instead of forming coherent sentences, devolved into an incoherent, garbled mumble, a string of disjointed sounds that his colleagues instantly dismissed as understandable exhaustion and lingering shock from a long, arduous trek. Their faces were etched with sympathy and bewilderment. Their attempts to understand met with his utterly fruitless efforts. His eyes, wide and desperate, pleaded for understanding, but met only with blank incomprehension. In that agonizing moment, a chilling realization washed over him, colder than any mountain stream. This was not his own muteness. It was the town, Redwood Falls. It did not release those who found it. It had erased itself from the memory of humanity, a deliberate act of self-preservation. And now it was, just as deliberately, erasing anyone who dared to disturb its profound silence, anyone who threatened to betray its terrible secret. Daniel felt invisible bonds, cold and constricting, tighten around his throat, sealing his lips, silencing his voice forever. The town had claimed his tongue, just as it had claimed his soul. He returned to his small, familiar cabin, a place that now was strangely hollow. He tried to revert to his usual routines. The comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the familiar creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath his feet, the soft, warm glow of his favorite reading lamp. All of it now was alien, utterly unreal, a grotesque parody of comfort. He saw fleeting shadows where none existed, heard low, guttural growls and the rustling of the wind against his window panes. His mind, once so sharp, so logical, now teetered constantly on the precipice, caught precariously between two terrifying, irreconcilable worlds. The distant hum of the nearby town, the muted murmur of civilization, which he had once found reassuring, now provoked a deep, visceral irritation. He unconsciously sought silence, that profound, primeval silence that had enveloped Redwood Falls. It became his new norm, his new sanctuary, a place where his fragmented thoughts coalesced, where the constant ringing in his ears momentarily subsided. The noise of civilization, with its oblivious, meaningless chatter, now was aggressive, profoundly alien, an unwelcome invasion into his shattered inner landscape. One night, before sleep, he stood before the small, cracked mirror in his cabin bathroom. His face looked gaunt, his features drawn and etched with a profound weariness, his eyes sunken and deep. But the familiar, rational sparkle that had once illuminated their depths was gone. Instead, deep within the pupils, he noticed something new, something barely perceptible yet profoundly unsettling. A faint amber glint, a subtle luminescence that glowed from within, like a smoldering ember. It was not his gaze that looked back at him from the mirror. It was the gaze of one who had seen an unspeakable horror, and who now carried that horror, a living, burning ember, deep within himself. The transformation had begun, and there was no turning back. Days blurred into weeks, then weeks into an endless succession of months. Daniel Harper, the meticulous park guide and geologist, was utterly incapable of performing his job. The cacophony of human noise, the casual indifference of people to the vast, hidden wilderness around them, their blithe cheerfulness, all of it became an unbearable torture. His colleagues, noticing the profound and undeniable changes, whispered among themselves, attributing his withdrawal to post-traumatic stress, a reasonable human explanation for an inhuman unraveling. But Daniel knew the truth, a truth that pulsed with the cold, undeniable certainty of a growing infection. The transformation, begun in the dead heart of Redwood Falls, was continuing relentlessly, irrevocably. He retreated deeper and deeper into the forest, seeking out those places where no human trails existed, where the silence was thick, pressing, and absolute. There, in the ancient, untamed wilderness, he had a strange, chilling sense of belonging, a profound, unsettling peace. He discerned subtle rustles and whispers that had once been inaudible to him, identified faint, complex smells that had previously been hidden from his senses. The forest, in its profound, ancient wisdom, spoke to him in its own primal language, a language of wind and rustling leaves, of damp earth and unseen movements, and he, to his horror and grim acceptance, slowly, inexorably, understood. The call of Redwood Falls, once a faint whisper, grew steadily stronger. a relentless, insistent siren song that pervaded his waking thoughts and infested his nightmares. He felt it as a physical ache, a deep, unquenchable thirst that gnawed at his very core. The town was summoning him back, asserting its terrible ancient rights, claiming him as its own, and Daniel knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he could not, would not resist forever. His human will, his old personality, the very essence of the man he once was, slowly dissolved, eroding like sand beneath a relentless tide. One night, standing before the chipped mirror in his cabin, Daniel saw not himself reflected in the glass. His features had sharpened, his jawline becoming more pronounced, his cheekbones more angular. His gaze, once weary, was now wild, untamed, burning with an ancient, predatory intensity. And most chillingly of all, the pupils of his eyes no longer held their familiar color. They blazed, undeniably with a pure, penetrating amber light, exactly the same unnerving glow he had seen in the eyes of the guardians, the werewolves, as they stood silently surrounding him on that terrible, transformative night in the church. It was the final, undeniable proof. He tried, with a desperate, agonizing effort, to force out a single word, any scrap of memory from his old life, to cling to the fading vestiges of his humanity. But from his throat emerged only a low, guttural growl, a deep, resonant sound that was entirely inhuman. Words had vanished, gone, lost to him forever. Human speech, once his primary tool for connection and understanding, now was alien, unnecessary, a cumbersome and irrelevant relic of a world he no longer inhabited. He understood then, with a profound, terrifying clarity, that Redwood Falls had finally and irrevocably taken his voice, his name, his entire past. In that moment, gazing at his new, bestial reflection, Daniel had not horror, but a strange, deep, unsettling calm. The struggle was over. The resistance had ended. He was part of it now, part of Redwood Falls, part of its profound, watchful silence, part of its terrible ancient secret. He was no longer Daniel Harper, the park guide, the geologist, the rational man. He was a guardian, a sentinel, a protector of the thin, fragile boundary between worlds, a creature forged in the crucible of absolute terror and tragic necessity. The following morning, just before the first faint hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, he left his cabin. Without a backpack, without gear, without a single backward glance or a silent goodbye. His steps were confident, utterly silent, his powerful new form moving through the undergrowth with an instinctual ease. The forest, his old friend and now his new home, greeted him not as an intruder, but as its own. His amber eyes, burning bright in the pre-dawn gloom, looked steadily forward, towards the hidden, forbidden heart of Redwood Falls, his new eternal home. The town truly did not release those who found it. It consumed them, drawing them into its embrace, making them a part of itself, a part of its eternal watch, forever sealing their fate in its silent, forgotten, and now eternally guarded history.